This video is an epilogue to our two-part series on the Russian Civil War. The story told here is totally self-contained, but our series on the Civil War will provide useful context. You can check it out by clicking the link on the top right of your screen. A Russian general is being held prisoner aboard a Crimean prison ship. Seated next to him is his wife. Our general knows that he's about to die, but doesn't want his wife there to witness it, so he makes an excuse to send her off. Before she leaves, he hands her a watch bracelet she had once gifted him. But he'd never taken it off before. This gesture tips her off that he's about to die. Moments after leaving, she returns. No matter what fate was in front of her husband, she was going to face it with him. The following night, they meet an interrogator from the Revolutionary Tribunal. He asks our ill-fated general, "Why were you arrested?" The man answers, "Probably because I am a Russian general. It is the only crime of which I am guilty." The interrogator then turns to his wife and asks her, "And why were you arrested?" She tells him, "I was not arrested. I am here of my own free will." The interrogator feigns surprise, but she continues, "I have always lived happily with my husband, and I want to stay with him until the end." The interrogator declares, "Such women are not to be found every day. You owe your life to your wife. Go." That night, 100 other men face the firing squad, but not the Black Baron of the White Army. Not Pyotr Wrangel. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is Pyotr Wrangel's Always with Honor. Let's jump in! The Red Terror intensified in the days following Wrangel's release, forcing him to flee the Crimea. He wandered around Eastern Europe until news reached him of the success of Denikin's volunteer army, so he put his children in the care of their grandmother and traveled with his wife, who intended to serve as a nurse, to Ekaterinodar. There, Wrangel was put in charge of a division. Wrangel found himself fighting an unbelievably brutal campaign. His unit even suffered a 100% casualty rate, but incredibly, it never lost its numerical strength because reinforcements came in as fast as the men were dying. Wrangel even saw some fighting himself, as he was a believer in leading from the front. His greatest achievement during this period was taking the key city of Tsaritsyn. Now, Wrangel was one of Denikin's best commanders, but also his main rival, so Wrangel was constantly second-guessing him. Wrangel wanted Denikin to enforce strict discipline and put a stop to the looting and pogroms that were ruining the White Army's reputation. He also insisted that they announce support for land reform. Those two things would have made the Whites immensely popular with the Russian people, while still remaining a fundamentally right-wing, anti-communist movement. But Denikin was afraid of splitting the Whites by taking what he believed to be unnecessary political stances. Wrangel was also a critic of the Moscow Directive, which was the White Army's great offensive towards Moscow. We go into detail about this operation and Wrangel's criticism of it in part 2 of our Russian Civil War series, but what matters here is that the operation failed, the Reds counterattacked, and Denikin's White Army was in retreat for the rest of the war. During this retreat, Denikin got more and more sick of Wrangel and eventually forced him into exile. Wrangel took refuge in Constantinople and was about to leave for Serbia when a message reached him. It was from Denikin, stating that he was resigning and that Wrangel was invited to a military council to elect a new commander-in-chief. Intrigued, Wrangel decided to attend. At the meeting, pretty much everyone wanted Wrangel to replace Denikin. So just like that, Wrangel became the commander of the last serious white movement in Russia. 35,000 under-equipped and demoralized men trapped in the Crimea. It's here our story really begins. Needless to say, the situation was bad. The peninsula couldn't feed itself and was devoid of natural resources. The British, who until now were the white movement's biggest sponsor, were sick of the whole Russia business and were threatening to cut Wrangel off if he didn't negotiate with the Bolsheviks. Wrangel played for time and used it to reform the White Army. The very first thing Wrangel did was make sure he could evacuate the peninsula. The Russian fleet had enough capacity for an evacuation, but not a single drop of fuel. If there was any sort of disaster at the front, the army would be stranded, so he used his limited resources to acquire fuel. He then took a full inventory of the White Army's supplies and reorganized it from emaciated divisions into properly organized full-strength units. The most combat-ready troops were sent to secure the Perekop Isthmus that connected the Crimea to Ukraine, and after defeating the Reds there, fortified it. The home front was his next point of concern. In spite of their constant harping on about law and justice, the Whites were just as rapacious as the Reds. Wrangel fixed this by creating courts with no systemic corruption and no special favors. Everyone could expect fair treatment under Wrangel. But even more popular than the law and order was land reform. Now, Wrangel is like super proud of his land reform bill, and I know this because he dedicates a whole chapter to describing it in detail, so if that sort of thing interests you, then you'll need to read the memoir yourself. What I'll say is that from a strategic perspective, it was a massive success. The peasants loved it. Wrangel then goes on to say that if Denikin had just implemented something similar, he would have won the Civil War. Wrangel also created a welfare system to keep the workers and incapacitated soldiers' families happy. And finally, to cap it all off, he renamed his forces to the Russian Army. This was to distance himself from the more rapacious Denikin, and helped emphasize the movement's nationalistic nature. By the time Wrangel was finished, morale in the White Army soared. In Wrangel's own words, Russians are inclined to pass in one moment from complete depression to the most radiant optimism. Those who had said not long ago that the Crimea was a tomb now regarded it as an impregnable fortress. But internal reform could only do so much. The Crimea still couldn't feed itself. The peninsula had always imported its food from northern Taurida. This made it the natural target for his first offensive. All this time, the Soviets had been moving forces to trap Wrangel in the Crimea. So when Wrangel began his offensive, the Soviets had 20,000 troops waiting for him. Wrangel outnumbered them slightly with 25,000 of his own men. Right before the battle began, the British sent him a message demanding that he not attack, and threatening to cut off their support for good. Wrangel simply responded by telling the British that this lack of reliable support was the very thing forcing him to attack. And with that, the Russian Civil War was back on. The Reds turned out to be poorly prepared, and the Whites swept over them, capturing a lot of equipment and prisoners. In just a few weeks, Wrangel captured all of northern Taurida, securing food for the Crimea, horses for his Cossacks, and even surplus resources which could be exported for supplies and equipment. And, since unlike Denikin, Wrangel respected law and order, the people actually saw the Whites as liberators, and were highly supportive. While Wrangel was bringing the Whites back into the Civil War, Poland was fighting its own battle against the Bolsheviks. By this point, they had chased the Soviets all the way to Kiev, stretched their supply lines, and were now being chased all the way back into Poland. Wrangel's offensive helped to relieve some of the pressure off of the Polish. From the sidelines, the French saw this as an opportunity. They wanted Poland and Wrangel to coordinate their efforts, so the French began to provide limited support to Wrangel, and even gave de facto recognition to his government. With northern Taurida secure by the Dnieper River, Wrangel needed to launch another offensive. The Bolsheviks were mustering their strength, so he wanted to use the initiative while he still had it. To that end, he prepared to land troops in the Kuban. Wrangel used his now properly fueled fleet to land 4,500 men there. Their mission was to rapidly seize key towns and cities in the Kuban, and inspire the local Cossacks to rise up and join the White Army. While this operation was going on, the Soviets attacked across the Dnieper. While they didn't take any ground, they were able to do a lot of damage to Wrangel's forces. Unfortunately, the Polish were in no position to help them. The Soviets were now within 50 miles of their capital at Warsaw. All of Wrangel's hopes rested on the Kuban campaign, but Soviet resistance was stronger than expected, and Wrangel claims that the commander in charge of the operation, Lullaby, was being too cautious and moving too slowly. The whole point was to take the Kuban in a lightning strike and bring tens of thousands of Cossacks into the army. But instead, the slow advance allowed the Reds to bring in an overwhelming number of troops. Lullaby was forced to ask for an evacuation. When all was said and done, the operation to take the Kuban turned out more like a raid. At the very least, Lullaby returned with more men than he started with, in the form of Cossack volunteers. And with that, Wrangel's last opportunity to take ground was gone. But there was at least good news coming out of Poland. The Soviet attack on Warsaw was a disaster, losing them hundreds of thousands of men. The Poles were even chasing them into Ukraine. If Wrangel could hold for a little longer, the Poles would eventually reach him, and together they could wipe out the Bolshevik menace once and for all. But Wrangel wasn't going to stand around and wait for them. He launched his own attack across the Dnieper. Unfortunately, he had long since lost the initiative, and the operation quickly stalled. Wrangel reassumed defensive footing south of the river, waiting for the Poles to relieve him. But then, the unthinkable happened. The Poles made peace with the Bolsheviks. No help was coming. All that was left to do now was to conduct the rest of the war as honorably as possible. Instead of retreating into the Crimea, Wrangel decided to hold northern Taurida. The way he saw it, Taurida had valuable resources, and thus gave him a lifeline that he would not have in the barren Crimea. The Soviets made their preparations to crush the last of the White movement, even making an alliance with the anarchist blacks. By the time of the offensive, Wrangel was outnumbered 3-1. They forced Wrangel out of northern Taurida, but were unable to cut him off from retreating into Crimea. Luckily, the peninsula was well fortified by this point, and since Wrangel had naval superiority, the Soviets would have to attack those defenses head-on. Or at least that's what everyone thought. But then, a freak weather event, strong winds from the northwest, hit the Crimea, causing the water around the peninsula to lower. The newly revealed mud hardened, making it traversable for large army formations. The communists wasted no time exploiting this. Several divisions were sent across, their advance covered by thick fog. By the time the Whites realized what was happening, the Reds were already behind them. But the waters also returned to normal, so they were trapped. While all of that was going on, Wrangel was invited to a musical evening for charity. To prevent a panic over the crisis, he attended. Internally, he was racked with anxiety, but externally, he was the same stern, confident Wrangel that everyone trusted and relied on. Both sides were engaged in truly life-or-death fighting. Retreat really wasn't an option for anyone, but the Reds won out in the end. And just like that, Wrangel's position in the Crimea became untenable. He had to evacuate his men. He always knew that this day might come, so he was ready for it. The French agreed to cover the cost of evacuation and to help the refugees, so Wrangel got to work saving his people. He took control of all communication and rail stations, sent ships to the ports where the men were to embark, and made sure to load up the wounded and most important equipment and personnel first. Once they were all secure, the real evacuation could begin. Wrangel not only loaded up his soldiers, but also everyone who was at risk of suffering from Bolshevik reprisals. This situation could have easily descended into chaos. Whites were unhappy about seeing their army abandon them, while Reds tried to cause as much chaos as possible to hinder the evacuation. But the operation was so well planned, and the troops so disciplined, that other than a brief riot that lasted for an hour, everything proceeded smoothly. Wrangel was among the last to leave. Right as he was about to board, he was seen off by an emotional crowd. It included the most influential men in the Crimea, foreign ambassadors, and at one point, a young girl, who told him, "God bless and keep you, Your Excellency." Wrangel asked her, "Are you remaining here?" The girl replied, "Yes, I have a sick mother, and I cannot abandon her." Wrangel told her, "God bless you too." Wrangel and the exiles boarded their ship, the General Kornilov, named for the man who started their southern Russian white movement. Wrangel ends the scene by saying, "The Russian spirit is great, and the Russian soul unfathomable." When all was said and done, the evacuation was carried out perfectly. In total, 100,000 soldiers and 50,000 civilians were evacuated from the Crimea. The coming years would be hard for these refugees, and they would soon form the nucleus of the Russian white exile movement, who created a diaspora in many countries in the Balkans and across the world, Wrangel among them. Always with Honor is a truly incredible memoir of the last chance to save Russia from communism. I'd highly recommend reading it. Wrangel was not just an excellent general, but a fine writer too. And that's Pyotr Wrangel's Always with Honor. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And if you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, becoming a channel member, and PayPal, links to all of which can be found below. Up next, we're going to find out what the Poles were doing all this time. I'll see you then.